Good day, friends. My name is H.B. Charles Jr. I am the pastor of the Shiloh Church in Jacksonville and Orange Park, Florida. I am the author of several books, It Happens After Prayer, The Difference Jesus Makes, On Preaching, and my newest book, On Pastoring, all by Moody Publishers. I also am the host of the On Preaching podcast that you can find on iTunes, and you can find other resources at hbcharlesjr.com. It is my joy to be here today with one of the great influences in my life and preaching ministry. Dr. Jasper Williams, for more than 50 years, has been a pastor of the historic Salem Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, a national preacher, a preacher's preacher, and one who has invested in not just his generation, but the generations behind him to help develop faithful preachers. And I'm honored to have him as our guest. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you so very much. I'm very happy and delighted to be here with you. You are one of those giants of the ministry, as you have articulated what you think I am. I want you to know that you have a giant footstep in the gospel arena, and you two are one of the tall timbers of the gospel forest.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. So, Dr. Williams, you're from Memphis, Tennessee originally?
That's right, Rev.
Tell us a little bit about your background, your upbringing.
Okay, I'm the son of a great Baptist preacher, similar to you,
Yes, sir.
in a way of speaking. Reverend J.W. Williams Sr. is the name that he went by back in that day. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. Fact about it, Aretha Franklin, father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, and my uncle and father were all preachers, and they all lived on the same street.
Wow.
In Memphis, which was called Lucy Street. Aretha's a year older than I am. She was born in 42. I was born in 1943. So I came up in a gospel Baptist background. My father was struggling and made it and got on the radio with a 5,000 watt station, WDIA, at that time in the early 50s, and then was able to be one of those to be on a station for 50,000 watts, and he became very popular over the whole Mid-South.
Wow.
And so he took me everywhere he went, and that's where it all started for me.
So you have preacher's kids, as we both are, but they're preacher's kids who dread and hate the whole experience, and then those of us who love it. You'd be in that latter category.
That's what I am. I came to Atlanta, and my sophomore year is when Salem became available, and they called me when I was 19.
Wow.
And I've been there this year. It's 53 years.
Wow. What kind of church was Salem when you got there? What was this like, still in your teens, in your first pastorate? What was that like, away from home, still in school? What was that journey like early on?
Before I answer that question, just let me say that that's a question that the average person would not even think to ask. You got to be some kind of a guy, and certainly a preacher in the heart,
Yes, sir.
to ask a question like that.
Yes, sir.
To start out with, the church was a two-Sunday church. When I say two Sundays, I mean that it only convened every second and fourth Sunday. And when they called me to be pastor, they wanted a full-time pastor, so I accepted the church, and it was a situation where I had to make the church. They started me off with $50 a week, and I just went on and took it and gave it my best. People started coming from every place, and it grew and it grew and it grew, and it got larger and larger. And this is one of those things that I think is an excellent point to make for preachers and pastors who may be viewing this at this time, that when you go into a situation as a pastor, you don't make decisions and tell people to change this, that, and the other as soon as you get there. One of the key things that you have to do is to sit back, preach, befriend the people, get your salary and go home.
Yes, sir.
You know, that was what I found to be the thing that I had to do. They were very touchy. It was a situation where the deacons ran the church. The deacons told me all they wanted me to do was to preach and sit down. But you guess what I did, Reverend? I preached and I sat down.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I mean, that was they told me that was what they wanted me to do. I learned that that was the best thing for me to do in order to survive the situation. And consequently, the Lord blessed me at that time. Some things you can't change no matter what it is. Some things you have to let God take care of. And there are some things that God only takes care of through death.
Yes, sir.
And I learned that and adjusted to that. And consequently, the Lord has brought me to where I am.
Praise God. So during this time as the church is growing, you are also somewhere along this line developing a national ministry in terms of your. How is this like happening at the same time? And what becomes the turning point where Jasper Williams becomes a national preacher?
Good question. Well, for me, when I looked at Reverend Franklin and how he had made albums and cutting records was the key in the mid-60s. Nobody was doing it much. Nobody was out there except Reverend Franklin. And so in 1963, when the church called me, I cut my first album in like 1965, which was It Walls Could Talk. And then I did another thing, I'm Black and I'm Proud. It was during the era when taking the titles of songs and popular sayings and you make sermons out of it, it was the thing that tickled the fancy of people at that time. And I came along at that time, and God had sort of gifted me to be able to do that relatively successfully.
Sure.
And so I put those albums out there and was able to hook up with Jewel Recording Company. They were promised to give you X number of dollars. You never get the money that you're supposed to get along that line, but yet it made me popular. So bittersweet is what I would describe it. Sweet in that I was becoming popular, bitter in that I was making no money, but yet older you get, you come to realize that money is not the whole thing, and you come to realize that God works in many, many ways, and that the key for you as a preacher, pastor along the way is to always have an ear to the ground to where you can hear when God is around.
Yes, sir.
Without that, you lose everything.
Wow.
Have the dollars, try to get the money. We all got to have that. But first and foremost is to know that I am in the will of God.
Yes, sir.
The worst feeling to ever have is to be out there as a pastor preacher. That's about the best I can tell you.
Yes, sir. That is great advice. Great advice. If I may pull aside for a moment. Your father had a great influence on you, but also Dr. C.L. Franklin had a great influence on you. For the alien who may watch this and do not know who C.L. Franklin is. That is an alien.
Especially if he's a preacher.
Yes, sir. Tell us a little bit about Dr. Franklin and your relationship with him and the influence he had on you.
I say guru not as a negative term. He was the guru preacher of the day.
Yeah.
He was a great man. He had the whole country by himself at one time. You know, wherever he went, people came, and it was because he had the sensitivity of being able to do the albums. Reverend Franklin himself didn't do that. It was like what God does for all of us in our ministries if you let God do it.
Yeah.
God will always put you in a place to where you can better yourself if you are sensitive to listening to where God is.
Yeah.
Like he fell into the making of albums. Nobody had thought to do that. And a guy came to his church, recorded him one day, and put it out there. And the next thing he knew, he was all over the nation.
Wow.
And so it was just as overwhelming to and for him as it was those who were listening. So I say that to say to the preacher and to the pastor who may be listening to me right now, there's something about you, there's something about your ministry right now that you have that God can take and make you bigger and better than you ever thought you could be.
Wow.
All of the hustle and bustle that you're trying to do now to make yourself, be faithful to the ministry and let God make you.
Wow.
Back to Reverend Franklin, he fell into that, Reverend, and became very, very big as a preacher pastor, and he became like my idol as a pastor preacher, as he was that to many, many people. And so he asked me to come do revival for him after I had reached a point, and that was to me like the highlight of my ministry, to do revival for Reverend Franklin. And so I went, did the revival for him, and then the next year he asked me to do the revival. So I had done revival for him for like about 5 straight years. And then he asked me to do the revival for him, and just before the revival is when he got shot in 1979. Well, he stayed in a coma for 5 years. He passed in 1984. Well, I went back and did the revival for the church while he was comatose. And each time that I did the revival, on that last night, I would take an offering. And when I took the offering, I would take it to Aretha, make sure she got the money, whatever it was, to just say I wanted to do this to help with him.
Yeah.
So when he passed, I was nowhere thinking that I would have the honor of eulogizing him and preaching his homegoing.
Wow.
I never thought that. Caesar Clark, you may know, I remember him.
Yes, sir.
He and Reverend Franklin were very good friends. I would have thought that he would have preached his funeral, and parts of the family wanted Caesar Clark to do the funeral. Also at that time was the first time that Jesse Jackson had run for president, and Jesse Jackson was like a son to Reverend Franklin. He would go by Reverend Franklin's house all the time, and they were very close. I thought that he would have done it. But the family called me and told me that they had had a family meeting, and that even though Jesse was a presidential candidate and Reverend Clark was very close, that I was the only one who had tried to do something to help with him.
Yeah.
And for that reason, they asked me to preach his funeral. Now, I come back to you pastors who are watching and listening to me right here, right now, to tell you that when you take yourself out of your ministry and don't concentrate totally on the aggrandizement of yourself. See, always let God be first. Let the ministry be first. Listen to God's voice. If you're living a lifestyle that is so bad that you can't hear the voice of God, you need to quit anyway. We're all going to get in situations as pastors and preachers, because we're human, to where it's going to pull on you where you are. I know about all of that. I know about dealing with people in the church. I know about living a lifestyle that's not congruent and conducive for a preacher, pastor. But I also know about the whipping that God can give you as a result of that. Stay as close to God as you can. Live as good for God as you can. Be as faithful to the ministry as you can. And then watch God work. I hope you all hear me out there. I'm back to you, Pastor.
Yes, sir. Amen. That is great advice. Praise God for that. Yes, sir. And so with that funeral, there is a, if this I hope an appropriate word, a kind of a mantle fell
Yes.
from Dr. Franklin onto you in terms of becoming more of a premier preacher.
That's what a lot of people say, Reverend.
Yes, sir.
A lot of people say that. I'll tell you about that sermon. You know, we're preachers.
Yes, sir.
Well, when he passed, I had just preached Good Soldier at my church for no reason. I just had preached. It was almost like, you know, how God gives you one of those sermons, and next thing you know, you are in a situation where the only sermon that could have fitted that situation was that sermon.
Yes, sir.
That's the way it was with me with that. I had just preached the sermon at my church, not thinking about anything. The last thing that I would ever preach is funeral.
Yeah.
But when I was asked to preach his funeral, as preachers, you know, we first start thinking about what I'm going to preach.
Yes, sir.
And so it was never what I'm going to preach. I just knew Good Soldier was the sermon to preach.
Yeah, man.
And so there again, the Lord just opened that way for me.
And of all of the great African-American preachers who have been eulogized, I don't know of a more memorable sermon than that one. To talk about preaching, in your pastoral ministry, what was your week to week in those heavy lifting years? Did you do series? Did you plan out preaching? Or was the Lord leading you from week to week about what you would preach?
Well, to me, the dumbest thing that any preacher can do is not get ready to preach. Okay?
Yes, sir.
It's not but three things about preaching that I think about. One, get ready to preach. Two, preach.
Yeah.
And three, rest from preaching.
Yes, sir.
And while you're resting, you get ready to preach again.
Yes, sir.
Now, Dr. Charles, I know you know that because that's the kind of preacher you are.
Yes, sir.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes,
so
sir.
you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I hope some of you all that are looking at me right now come to understand that. The worst sermon for any preacher to preach is what we call a Saturday night special.
Yes, sir.
A Saturday night special is a sermon that you wait until Saturday night to get together. That's the dumbest thing that you can do as a preacher. You can't preach that kind of a thing. You got to work all week long. Reverend, we work, if you're successful in a pulpit, you've got to work. I start getting ready to preach the next Sunday on the Sunday night I've just finished preaching.
Yes, sir.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And then it's an all-week situation. And then you got to have not only the concentration for getting ready to preach, you got to have the consecration to where you spend time in prayer and asking God to meet you when you hit the pulpit.
My.
I have never preached. I'm 73 years old next month. On the second Sunday in August, I would have been preaching for 66 years. And I've been pastoring the same church for 53 years as of the second Sunday in November. And there has never been a time that I've mounted a pulpit and did not pray first. Never, never, never. Moments that you succeed, moments that you fail, moments that you wish that you had done something else. All of that, yes, I've been through it, but it was not because I did not pray.
My.
So if you ever hear anything that I say in terms of advice for a preacher, pastor, wherever you are in your ministry, in your preparation, always, no time exceptional, always have time to pray.
Yes, sir. One of the first things I heard about you before I ever heard you preach or heard one of your messages was that you were a note-free preacher.
Yes.
Back off in the day, you'd move the pulpit out maybe
Yeah.
and just stand with the mic. And I had never heard of that. My dad and all of my dad's preaching friends were off the script, manuscript preachers. My father used to call this a flat-footed preacher.
Yeah, I know the term. Yes, sir.
And really hearing you for the first time and hearing Dr. Donald Parsons for the first time
Okay.
moved me toward preaching note-free. But one thing I think missed in that is this was not extemporaneous preaching, just getting up, filibustering.
No.
The same. I watched you, and the whole idea is that those who make it look easy work hard to make it look easy.
Oh, you got it.
Yes, sir.
You got it.
Yes, sir.
That's exactly.
But you were writing manuscripts
Yes.
back off in the day when you were not using them.
I was writing manuscripts and memorizing them,
Mm-hmm.
but taking it a step beyond memorization
Okay.
to the point that it had to be in me. In other words, instead of just memorizing the sermon head, I had to memorize, have it in my heart, be a part of my walk, become my talk.
My.
You understand?
Yes, sir.
And that's how hard I worked.
Yes, sir.
It took me 2 days sometimes to get to that point, you see. Because when you hit a pulpit, you don't want to hit a pulpit just to memorize. You memorize something, any little thing that happens over here can make you forget
Right.
about what you were supposed to say. But when it becomes a part of you, then it's beyond memorization.
So were you trying to hit a point during the week where you were done with your work so that kind of internalization takes place?
There you go. Nobody would know to say that but a preacher, man, like you. That's exactly what you do. You lay out your time. By this time, I've got to finish reading, research.
Yep.
This time I'm through writing. By this time I start my memorization. This time I have memorized it. Now it has become a part of me. Now I'm ready for the pulpit. That's all week.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, let me ask you about some of those sermons
Yes.
that you were able to record. I mentioned to you before our recording, the first sermon, my favorite Jasper Williams sermons is the first sermon I heard you preach. Someone gave me an audio of when it seems the Lord is taking too much time. The story of Mary and Martha
Yes.
in John 11 was just masterful. And if I was in a jam, unfortunately, and needed something to preach, I could preach that sermon by memory. Right now, I've heard that sermon so many times. I couldn't do this interview without asking you about the most famous sermon that you have preached. Dr. C.L. Franklin was known for the eagle stirreth the nest.
Yes.
You are known, of all the great sermons you've preached, for I fell in love with a prostitute.
Looks like that will be what they'll say. Yes.
Yes, sir.
I like to think I preached a lot more.
Yeah. You have indeed. Yes, sir. That just is a statement about the impact of that message. How did that sermon develop? Because alongside of that message was also something that was rare still rare, done well, first person narrative, where now in seminaries, guys are trying to figure out what you was doing back in the day. Yeah. Tell us about how that sermon idea developed.
Well, you know, there's such a thing, and I know you're familiar with this, where you have the evolving of a sermon. You know, you preach a sermon 5 years ago, it was this, and then you try to perfect it when you go back to it. And that's what that sermon is to me. The very first time that I preached it was in like about 1967 or 8.
Okay.
And I preached it from the subject, the beloved prostitute. You know, just going along. And then as time went along, I changed it to I fell in love with a prostitute. And then still perfecting it, I took it to the first person that you just referenced. I fell in love with a prostitute talking as though I'm talking to God. And so I have evolved it through the decades.
Yeah.
Dependent upon the times, because preaching changes with the times. You know, as the times change, people change, preaching changes.
Yes, sir.
I have been privileged to live in preaching for 6 decades now, and I've been privileged to see the pendulum of preaching move from one extreme to another, and then back some, and then forward some. Back when I came along, the usage of titles, making sermons out of them was one thing, but before then, that was what we call biblical sermons, that preachers would just go in to get theological thoughts with Bible and Bible alone, and then the fancy preaching with titles came into existence, and then the expository preaching. But the key to it all is whatever kind of preaching you are preaching, find you in it. See, you got to find yourself. When the greatest sermon that I preached, to me at one time, should have been The Eagle Stirred the Nest. But that wasn't Jasper Williams.
Wow.
I had to find myself. And sometimes you can make the mistake of looking for others in your preaching when the greatest thing to look for is you in your preaching.
Wow.
Because if God has called you, he's given you something that nobody else has. And the challenge for you as a preacher pastor is to find what is my something that God has given me that ain't nobody got but me. And when you find that, that's when you find your power. I don't know how to tell you no more than
Yes,
that.
sir. Yes, sir. And I'll tell you, some of my worst chewing out about preaching from my old man was about you.
Is that right?
Yes, sir. Because I was 13 years old, throwing a handkerchief over my shoulder. I had the gazelles. I wanted to be Jasper Williams. And my father would get up and say to the church, pray for this young man, because there are others that can beat him being Jasper Williams, but no one can beat him being himself.
Wow.
And he needs to learn that. And I didn't learn that till after my dad died, and I was invited to preach, and I'm preaching one of your sermons, and a guy in the pulpit is saying, "Say it, Jasper." Wow. And all of the preachers are giggling, and it's an embarrassing moment, and I deserved every moment of it.
But it made you a preacher.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Reverend,
yes,
I
sir.
can feel that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Yes, sir.
I hope you all heard that, because that's where a lot of you are. It's not in other people. It's what God has put in you that is the power that he can use you to change the world.
Praise God. So I have been listening to your audios for years.
Yes, sir.
Before I got a chance to hear you in person. But by the time I got a chance to hear you in person, you were making a shift toward more expositional preaching.
Yes.
I would say my pastor, Dr. Melvin Wade, went through that shift. His best friend, E.K. Bailey, went through that shift, but not not every seasoned, established preacher, when you got what's working for you, can pivot. You were able to make a pivot at a certain point in the middle of your ministry. What was that turning point for you when you began to point toward expositional preaching? You got to a place where you started bringing manuscripts to the pulpit.
Yes.
And those kinds of changes. What marked those changes
Good question.
for you? Yes, sir.
Well, a lot of things could have contributed to that. Workload.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Just being frank.
Yes, sir.
Workload, having more challenges, but also the desire to be more depthful.
Sure.
And when you realize that much of what I was doing in the earlier days was showmanship, it made me have a showmanship church.
Wow.
A church that would want to come because they wanted to see the show today.
Yeah.
And I reached a point to where that wasn't what I was looking for.
Sure.
There again, God changes as you move along, keeping that ear to where you can hear when it's time for a change.
Yeah.
And then the thirst that showmanship could not quench anymore.
My.
Caused me, all of these contributing factors caused me to make the change that I did.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say this about preaching. No preacher who's preached any substantive period of time will ever preach the same way all of that time.
Sure.
Because you've got to change as time moves along.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So when I got here, I had been pastoring for 18 years.
Okay.
I had been preaching more than 25 years. And I got here in a just a hustle to keep studying. And my wife says, "Boy, you a new fool. You got all these files of sermons, and you still studying." Well, first of all, sermon preparation becomes a part of our devotional life.
Right.
It's a sanctifying work of God.
Right.
It's some things I stay out of because I got to get ready to preach.
Yes.
But I would also say, at 43, I don't sound like the guy who was at 23 and at 33. And just growing older and I hope more mature. And if you're not changing in your preaching, something is wrong.
Something's radically wrong.
Yes, sir. You're absolutely right about that, Doc.
I concur with that wholeheartedly, Doctor.
So one of the features of your preaching, however, consistently through the years, has been your classic close.
Okay.
And talk to us about the evolving of hooping. We're in a generation, though, where, you say we had this pendulum swing. We're at this YouTube age where this is all some young guys think the sermon is about.
Yes.
And some of them are just filibustering to get to that point, which has never been characteristic of your ministry. And even though you will admit it that you were influenced by your connection to Dr. Franklin, you have your own style that you develop. Just whatever you want to say about hooping. I'm just trying to lob you on over the plate there.
Well, thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
And that's an excellent question. That's a preacher question. Nobody would ask that question but a real preacher.
Yes, sir.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
And that's what you obviously are.
Yes, sir.
A real preacher. The hoop thing is something that changes also. I'm 73 years old next month, but hooping like I did 20 years ago is not in the demand now as it was then.
Wow.
And you've got to be able to sense that. Every once in a while, I'll go back to doing that. It's why I work on keeping myself physically able and in physical shape as I can to be able to do that. But the quicker you get to the hoop now, in other words, you know, when you go a long ways around tuning up, getting ready to come to the hoop part, people nowadays, they tired of that. They don't want to hear that.
Yes, sir.
You know, you got to get you a hoop now to where you can go right to it if you need to.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If you want to. So that's what I have found myself of a late working to do. You know, it's more situational now.
Sure.
That whatever situation you find yourself in, you're able to adapt what is the best way to close this situation.
Yes.
And I'm able to do that. I also want to suggest that you don't have just one. You know, you got to have several different ways that you can climax a sermon nowadays.
Yes, sir.
And you've got to become a situational closer.
Yes, sir.
You know, that you don't just close the same way because the situation may not warrant that.
Yes, sir.
But there again, keeping that ear to the ground, hearing the voice of God, following the directions of that will help you to develop more than just one way. I have quite a few ways I try to get to the climax now.
And so it's not just also the situation that dictates the close, but also the sermon.
The sermon itself.
And years ago, when I was in Los Angeles, I came to hear you. Took a friend who I'm sure just wanted to come to hear you close. And we came to Praises of Zion to hear you at Dr. Joe B. Hardwick's church. And on several of those occasions, you didn't, in a revival, you had one message was on divorce, one message another year was on prophecy, and you just gave your message and made a U-turn and went to your seat. Yeah. And there are times where the message is ruined if you don't close it or land it the right way.
That's exactly right.
Yes, sir.
You spot on.
Yes, sir. So how did you balance? This is an interesting question. When I was a young preacher, they would say that guy is an administrator, which means, you know, he good at building the church, he can't preach. You know?
That's what he did. Exactly.
It was a nice way of saying he couldn't preach. And then it was that guy who was a preacher, but wasn't necessarily a good leader, pastor. And then all the more that might be said of a guy who is pastoring but also has an itinerant ministry. What has been for you the balancing point? Because you were pastoring a growing church over the years and then had a demanding ministry outside of your pulpit as well, around the nation. How were you balancing, how do you balance those two realities, which in many weeks you are having to prepare on the road?
Right.
Yeah.
I used to carry.
And you didn't have computers and all the other stuff we got available to us now.
I used to have a suitcase that I would put the books in. I would have a suitcase filled with nothing but books.
Wow.
So that while I'm preaching sermons on the road that I knew, when service was over, I was studying. Yeah. Fixing the sermon so that when I get back home on Sunday, I'm ready to preach. Yeah. Yeah. See, that's going back to what you're talking about, working hard.
Yes, sir.
That when you succeed, a person who succeeds is a person who works hard. But I didn't get the whole question that you were asking me, HB. Repeat the question again.
So I'm asking the question about, which will not be everybody's situation, but there is some kind of balance you have to be able to lead a growing church with all of the attention it required.
Yes.
And then also being on the road.
Yes.
at the same time.
Yes.
Being in the pulpit, being on the road, which is his own challenge. So I preached this week at a youth camp in Oklahoma, Monday through Friday, 5,000 teenagers every night. But when I got here this morning, they couldn't have cared less, you know. So you got to balance that world and then the local church world and all that you got to do. And you've done that for some years.
Yes.
You know, now you've had to manage that way.
Well, one thing I made mandatory in my life, and that is never to be away from my pulpit on a Sunday morning.
Yes, sir.
No matter what my obligations are.
Gotcha.
Always be ready for Sunday morning.
Yes, sir.
And whatever it took for me to do that, that's what I did.
Yes, sir.
To me, it's not a matter of how much work I got to do.
Gotcha.
It's a matter of what I got to do. Let me go do this so I can get it done.
Yeah.
See, when you bicker and got to moan and groan and whine and cry about working as a preacher to perfect the art of preaching, you don't have no business being in the pulpit.
Yeah.
But when preaching is first, you know, and that this is all I'm going to do and want to do, what looks like work to you is not no work.
Yeah.
This is just what I do.
Sure.
You know, so then all of that to me is a part of the call.
Yes, sir.
That along with being able to stand and articulate, I got to be able to lay and study to get ready to stand and articulate.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Whatever it takes.
So there's a story I heard about a maestro that gets off a stage from playing the piano, and a young protege is standing on the side, and he says to the maestro, I'd give my life to play like that. And the maestro says, son, I did. You know? Yeah, I mean, you can't be a faithful preacher with a half-hearted commitment. You've got to give your life. You really do have to give your life.
That's right.
To it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there are just no shortcuts. That's what I hear you saying.
No shortcuts.
No, there are just no shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
Yeah. No. So did you expect? I am a student. My father pastored the church that I succeeded him in for 40 years. My pastor, Melvin Wade, has been at his church for more than 40 years. My adopted dad, John Reed, in Oklahoma City, has pastored his church for 50 years. And many others who have influenced me have been men who just kind of planted their flag and hung on in one place for a long time. Did you expect that you would? Some guys say, this is where I'm planted, I'm not moving. What was your did you have an expectation that this would be your place of ministry throughout? And what would you say to a young pastor are keys to a long pastor? Because some guys run out of their little trick bag in 3 years and got to go somewhere else. Yes. You know, yes. What are the keys to a long and fruitful ministry in one place?
Well, the key to me was people thought that Salem was supposed to be a stepping stone for me. I had a lot of people, preachers and people in general, to say that if you at Salem can do a pretty good job, it will get you ready for Wheat Street, where Dr. Borders pastored. Well, I went home and started thinking about, I'm not going to sit around and wait to get nobody else's church. I'm going to take my church and make it the Wheat Street I can make it be. You know, it's about taking what you got.
Wow.
Using what the Lord has given you. I mean, you know, where he gave David a stone, he gave Moses a rod.
Yes, sir.
So, you know, I'm going to take my rod, you use your stone and do whatever else you got to do, but this is what I got.
Yes, sir. Use
what I got to let it lead me to where he wants me to be.
Yeah.
And I'm always on safe ground.
That is great. That is great. You cannot be faithful and effective looking out the window.
There you go.
That's something else you got to focus.
Exactly
Yeah,
right.
That is great. That is really great. Praise God. So there was a part in time where you also have a heart for young preachers.
Yes.
For many years, I were not able to get to the E.K. Bailey conference. One of my favorite tapes, though, I'd send my preachers, they'd bring me the tapes back.
Okay.
And one year you were supposed to talk about hooping and just spent most of your time just giving advice to young preachers.
Yes.
And it just, over the years, just watching you, whenever you have, I've just seen you, when you got an opportunity, you're trying to find a way to bless young preachers.
Yes.
You invited me as a young preacher to do the late night in Louisville one night. I was telling my kids last night, you just reached into your pocket and gave me a little bit of money.
Wow.
And that may not be something you remember, but just this pattern of being kind to young preachers. What prompts this burden? Because some guys, you know, there are older pastors in your generation, you know, that you get it the way I got it, and it was rough on me. But you've been known for just trying to reach and lift up young preachers.
You
What?
got to have a freeness of your spirit as it relates to giving. I don't say that everybody's got to be like I am.
Okay.
Because some people can look at me with the freeness that I try to be and say that my giving is almost to a level of being a fault
Okay.
of mine. And it may well be as you see it. But to be liberal and free is just the basis of who I am.
Yeah.
And I like responding to what touches me. So when I see young preachers struggling or whatever, old preachers, whatever, I'm prone to go in my pocket and just do for them. Not to say that you ought to do it like me, but that's just kind of my thing. It's a spiritual thing with me. So if you're not looking at it from a spiritual perspective, by no means would I advise you to do this. You know, it's the thing that God has given me. You heard of the gift of giving? Everybody doesn't have that gift. So if it's not yours, leave it alone. But it happens to be mine, and it's one of those things that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Yes, sir.
To have an open spirit to where you share with people, great thing for me.
Praise God. So you've been very generous with your time. I do have one closing question. This is the question I like to close
Okay?
these interviews with. You have found a time machine, and you are able to go back 50 years, 60 years, to 19-year-old, 21-year-old Jasper Williams, who is just getting started. What do you know now that this Jasper Williams, seasoned, mature experience, would say to the young Jasper Williams who is just going on his journey?
Wow, that's a loaded question. That's some kind of question there, man. Well, as I sit here and allow my mind to stroll back down memory's lane and think about where I am now and look back at what I was, the only way I made it is that God brought me. Period. Crazy, dumb, stupid, just like some of you all are right now. Did some of everything. Did some things as a preacher, pastor, that I could never be proud of, but I did it. The human side came out. That's why I challenged you earlier about live as good as you can, but when you know you're doing wrong, you got to make amends for that and try to change it before it changes you. I can take a butt whooping, so to speak, from any person, any man, but I don't never, ever want to take one of those from God. So if you know you're at that point, get up, step up, shape up, make it better, and move on. Thank you for that, Doctor.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that candid advice. And thank you for the sacrifice of your time. It has been a great honor. I cannot tell you what an honor this is and what a blessing you have been to me from afar. And it's a joy to have this time with you.
I'm glad to have done it for you.
Yes, sir.
I really am. If I've contributed to you, believe me, it's been more of a contribution that you have given me
Yes, sir.
for the opportunity of doing this
Yes.
than I have given you.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.
Went on the Calvary, went down in the grave, stay right there all night, Friday night, he stayed right there all day Saturday, he stayed right there all night Saturday night. That's all I got to tell you. Early, good God from on high. Early Sunday morning, you know what he did. He got up out of dusty grave. He pulled off a dying sword. He stepped up on resurrecting ground, raised his hand. Power. Do I have a witness? Oh, power. Oh, power. I got power. Preaching power. Teaching power. Singing power.
Pastor Charles has done it again. His new book on pastoring hits bookshelves on June 7th. The book discusses the devotional life, spiritual leadership, and public ministry of the pastor. This book is a must-read for everyone who serves in ministry. Books will be available in the Shiloh bookstore and online.